It's possible that for 155 years, a photo has lain undiscovered that, if proved to be genuine, would be one of, if not the, photographic finds of the century. Even if you don't know of the Brontë sisters, you'll have heard of their work. Amongst other titles, Emily Brontë wrote Wuthering Heights, Charlotte Brontë wrote Jayne, and Anne Brontë wrote The Tennant of Wildfell Hall. They were celebrated in their own lifetime, and their fame has only grown in the 2 centuries since their death. Together they wrote some of the finest works in the English language. Like the Beatles, they came from absolutely nowhere and disrupted the norms of the day. I'm in Brontë Central, Haworth in Yorkshire, and the Brontës are responsible for a tourism explosion here. People come from all over the world to see how and where they lived and to walk in their footsteps. You can even go to the parsonage where they lived and take a tour of it. There are several paintings that were made in their lifetime. Some of the paintings are very famous, but we still don't know exactly what they look like. No 2 paintings seemingly look alike. We have photos of their father, Patrick Brontë, and we have photographs of their contemporaries of the time. There's no shortage of Charles Dickens photos, for example, but not a single known photo of the Brontës exists, despite photography becoming very popular and common during the 1840s. We don't even have a photo of any of them individually. No known photo of them exists. It's all rather frustrating and unsatisfying. Photography was new, but by the end of the 1840s, there was a photographic studio in every town in Britain. It was big business and far more affordable than sitting for a painting. 3 of the greatest authors that England has ever produced, major celebrities of their day, and we don't even know what they look like. Or do we? A photograph was found more than 10 years ago in a private Scottish collection by a diligent and thorough English photographic researcher. There's no provenance attached to it, which is typical of photographs taken at the time. All we know for sure is that its previous owners could be traced to France. It's thought it was purchased in the Paris area. So what, you might ask? Well, on the back of it, in handwritten scrawl, are the words Londres, Sours Brontë, London, the Brontë sisters. And indeed, the photograph bears the image of 3 women wearing Victorian attire. Show the image to any Brontë fan and they can even point out who they believe the individuals to be. This is Emily, this is Charlotte, and this is Anne. They look broadly how we'd expect them to look from contemporary paintings and descriptions. So could it be true? Are we finally able to see an actual photograph of the Brontë sisters? Can we finally look into the eyes of Charlotte Brontë? Can we now put a face to the author of Wuthering Heights? There's mounting evidence and speculation that yes, it could be them. But there are many doubters too. Armchair detectives have pored over every conceivable element of this photograph, and many feel that they are inching ever closer to the truth. If it could be proved, it would indeed be the greatest Victorian photographic find of the century, possibly even ever. But can it be proved? We need to look at the evidence. Enthusiasts call it the LSB photograph, short for Sours Brontë. I call it absolutely fascinating. We've got it all here: a forensic English researcher, a mysterious Scottish collection, and a romantic French connection to boot. And we've got something else. We've got thousands of Brontë fans eager to know the truth. Viens avec moi as we investigate Sours Brontë. Yes, I'm bilingual. Oui, I can speak French. So, is this the Brontë sisters? 10 years ago, it didn't get off to a good start. Researchers shared the photo with experts at Bradford's National Media Museum. They weren't enthusiastic. For a start, they dated the photo to the 1850s, which did pose a problem. 2 of the sisters were dead by then. Emily died in 1848 and Anne died in 1849. The news wasn't much better when it was shared with the Brontë Society. They own and run the parsonage and curate all of the Brontë memorabilia and artefacts. Without their support, this photograph will never enjoy any legitimacy. They said, the thing you have to bear in mind is, why would anyone have wanted to paint or photograph them at that time? They weren't famous and were relatively poor women. There's no reference in any surviving correspondence to a group photograph of the sisters. Furthermore, a comparison of the women's features with those of the portraits in existence shows no resemblance to them. As if that appraisal wasn't devastating enough, they went on to say, whereas the portraits we know show striking striking family similarities between the three. These three women look completely unalike. Photography as a common means of portraying people was still in its infancy in the late 1840s when Emily and Anne died. And then came the knockout punch. Sadly, it's unlikely a group photograph of the three exists. They really didn't need the adjective group. Currently, no photograph of them exists, period. Maybe the word group, though, was specified intentionally. For a while, many people did believe that a photograph of Charlotte Brontë had been discovered, but now that has been widely accepted as a photograph of her friend, not Charlotte. So that was that. They were dead by the time that kind of photograph could have been taken. And anyway, the women look nothing like they do in their portraits. Debunks from Bradford's National Media Museum and the Brontë Society are hard to get around, and the photo was quickly forgotten. I don't mean to be critical of the museum or the society. They are not alone. Lots of people think it's not the Brontë sisters. Large organisations of repute, of course, need concrete evidence and facts, not idle speculation. I'm just asking if the photograph was dismissed just a little bit too hastily. There are a band of hardened, stubborn and wonderfully dedicated enthusiasts who have refused to back down quite so quickly. If I were to go through all of the evidence turned up by researchers, we'd run out of tape in the camera. But here's some of the main reasons that we shouldn't dismiss that photograph quite so quickly. The age of the photograph. This photograph is a photo on glass, also known as a collodion positive and sometimes called an ambrotype. It's true that these weren't around until the 1850s, and it's also true that that's way after Emily and Anne died. But this collodion positive could have been a copy of a previous type of photograph called a daguerreotype. It could be a photograph of a photograph. Daguerreotypes were common throughout the 1840s, and it was the very first commercial photographic process. I've put a fascinating YouTube video in the description of this video, along with my research sources, which shows the painstaking process of producing a daguerreotype. It was named after inventor Louis Daguerre. He took the first photograph of a human being using this process in 1838. Photography had been around for about a decade prior to Daguerre's invention, but it had a problem. Exposure time took 8 to 10 hours. No one can stay still for that long. The photo you're looking at now is the world's first, or certainly earliest, remaining photo taken in 1826 of only static buildings. French inventor Joseph Niepce left it on a windowsill all day to gain the necessary exposure. By the late 1830s, Daguerre had got that exposure time down to 3 to 15 minutes. Perfect for portraits, but still too long to hold a smile, which is why everyone seems to be so miserable on photos back then. This is the Boulevard du Temple in 1838. It's actually a very busy street scene in Paris, but all of the pedestrians and horse-drawn carriages can't be seen because no one hung around for the required exposure time. Except this guy. He's standing there getting his shoe shined, long enough to be captured on the image. He's the first human being ever to be photographed. The picture was taken by Daguerre himself. It was a success. Daguerre sold his invention to the French government so that the new technology could be used freely throughout all of humanity. That helped it to blossom quickly around the world. Daguerreotypes were taken on a highly polished silver surface on a copper plate. Many photos on glass, collodion positives, like our LSB photo, were made from daguerreotypes that were taken earlier. I suppose the modern equivalent would be when we take a photograph on our phone of an old photograph on paper. We can reproduce an old photograph with new photography technology. Eventually, exposure time was down to seconds, not minutes. So copying old daguerreotypes was quick and easy to do. One of the features of doing this, though, is that you often got distortion around the edges, and that's exactly what we see here. Another feature is that the pictures are often on a very slight angle, just like we see in our LSB photograph. As the photographer was taking the picture of the daguerreotype, he'd have had to tilt it a minuscule amount to avoid a reflection on the highly polished surface. You sometimes have to do that today if you're taking a photograph of a glossy image with your phone. You sometimes need to tilt it to avoid glare from a light source. So it's entirely possible, and from this evidence, very likely, that this photograph was originally a daguerreotype, which was later, in the 1850s, copied onto glass as a collodion positive, which is how we have it today. These women didn't sit for a collodion photograph, which wasn't even invented in the mid-1840s. They sat for a daguerreotype that was in common use at the time, which was subsequently copied onto glass at a later date. In my view, this is convincing and compelling evidence that our collodion photograph photograph is in fact a copy of an earlier daguerreotype. That runs absolutely contrary to the debunk that says it can't be genuine, because 2 of the sisters were dead by the time the technology was available. The hat is a problem. These kinds of hats, worn by ladies, were popular in the 1860s, featuring a turned-up brim at the sides, but not in the 1840s. It turns out, though, that there is an answer for this. An answer that could narrow down exactly when this photograph was taken. Men wore similar hats and had done for decades, maybe even centuries. It was called a wide-awake hat. This one appears to be a straw hat, and if this is the Brontë sisters, then the person wearing it is Emily Brontë. She was ill for 3 months prior to her death in December 1848. So this photograph would have to have been taken before October 1848. This style of hat was made popular by Jenny Lind, a Swedish opera singer. In fact, it became known as a Jenny Lind hat. She was a phenomenon when she toured England in 1847. Lind mania gripped Britain, much like a rock band would do now. The hat seemed to have been heavily borrowed from the men's wide-awake hat, and Lind wore one on stage. Because of the popularity of Jenny Lind, it was on sale in England by June 1847. Victorians were keen to cash in on a trend, just like we are today. She kicked off her England tour in May 1847, and her audience members numbered Queen Victoria herself. By the end of the summer, her show hit the road across northern England, and so did the popularity of the Jenny Lind hat. According to researchers, that hat was available in Leeds from November 1847, just 20 miles from Haworth. So if this is Emily Brontë, the date of the photograph must have been between June 1847 and October 1848. That's a 15-month window that the photograph could have been taken. Could they have afforded a photograph? The simple answer to this question was yes. Daguerreotype photographs were available in every town in Britain in the mid to late 1840s. The typical cost of a portrait was around £1, maybe a bit more for a group photograph. All 3 sisters had been working, and a typical annual salary of the day was £50 to £100. The bill split 3 ways would have been no problem at all. They were known to have made careful investments, and anyway, they'd all recently come into some money. Thanks to a legacy from their Aunt Branwell in 1843, they got £300 each. The Brontë Society asked, why would anyone have wanted to photograph them at that time? They weren't famous. Well, maybe they just had it taken for their own pleasure. They were, after all, first and foremost, artists. It seems perfectly reasonable that they would have been interested in this new art form. LSB enthusiasts respectfully suggest that anybody with a bit of spare cash was doing it. And the Brontës did have the money. By the end of the 1840s, it was common to see a framed and ornate daguerreotype on display in many a household. The French Connection. One of the most puzzling elements of this photograph is that the words on the back of it are written in French. The photograph is currently in a private Scottish collection, and we know its provenance can be traced back to France. It has Londres, Le Sours Brontë written on the back of it. There is an intriguing and convincing explanation for this, and for the answer we must look to events even after the death of the last Brontë sister, Charlotte Brontë, in 1855. By 1856, Charlotte's biographer, Elizabeth Gaskell, was writing her life story at the request of Patrick Brontë, the girl's father. She wanted a portrait painting of Charlotte to be photographed so that an engraving could be made for it for the book. She also wanted some photographs of the parsonage. Publishers Smith, Alder & Co. put amateur photographer John Stewart in touch with Gaskell, and he was commissioned to do the work. John Stewart visited the Brontë parsonage 3 times to carry out his photography work. He was a fine and technically proficient photographer. Taking a photograph, probably a collodion positive, of Charlotte's portrait proved no problem at all, and an engraving of the photograph was indeed used for Gaskell's biography of Charlotte Brontë. In February 1857, he returned to his home in Pau, southern France. It's entirely possible that Stewart could have taken the collodion copy of our LSB photograph during his 3 visits to the parsonage, and it's equally likely that he could have taken the photographs back home with him to France after the work was done. It's also possible that Charlotte's widower, Arthur Bell-Nichols, could have taken the original daguerreotype back to Ireland with him. Following the death of the father, Patrick Brontë, in 1861. From what I've read, Arthur was not particularly careful with the Brontë artefacts he took back to Ireland. We know one painting was folded up and one painting was ripped up. Could Arthur have destroyed or lost the original daguerreotypes? And I shouldn't just pin all the blame on Arthur for the loss of items. Lots of Brontë artefacts were lost, sold and forgotten by many people over many years. So with this evidence, we can confidently hypothesise that this photograph could have been taken in 1856 or early 1857 by John Stewart. He took a collodion positive of an existing daguerreotype during his 3 photographic trips to the parsonage before making his way back home to France. The original daguerreotype could have been lost at any time in Arthur's possession. In fact, it could have been lost by anyone. The lack of correspondence. The Brontë Society, in their debunk, cited the fact, saying that there was no correspondence from the sisters, saying that they'd had a photograph taken. They are the undisputed experts, and that fact is absolutely correct. But we've just heard that Arthur, Charlotte's widower, was known to have destroyed correspondence. Could some of this destroyed correspondence contain information about the LSB photograph? And anyway, just because they didn't write to somebody about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It is true that a lot of what we know about the Brontë sisters comes from surviving letters to friends, but they were very private women. It's entirely possible that they could have had a photograph taken for their own private use and not felt the need to broadcast the fact to the world. Had Facebook existed in 1847, I think they could have restrained themselves from posting it. The pillar painting. There are some similarities with this photo and the famous pillar painting of the Brontes that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. It's likely that this image was folded up and taken back to Ireland by Arthur Bell Nicholls in 1861. It wasn't discovered until 1914, languishing in a wardrobe. You can see the damage that the folders caused. We can see here that the 3 girls are all sitting on a similar level with a huge pillar between them. X-rays carried out by the National Portrait Gallery confirm that the pillar is in fact concealing their brother Branwell. It looks like he painted himself out, but had he been left in, it would have left the painting with a triangular composition, far more interesting and pleasing on the eye, and that's exactly what we see in our photograph. An interesting twist is that if we assume that the photograph was taken in the 1840s, the subsequent daguerreotype would have been reversed, with Charlotte on the right. If the sisters had have asked the photographer to show their preferred order, which was shown in the pillar painting, then the photographer would have known to have reversed the seating to achieve what they wanted. If our photograph is indeed a collodion positive taken from a previous daguerreotype, then it would have been flipped back to the original order that the 1840s photographer would have seen through his viewfinder. The daguerreotype hanging in the parsonage would have looked like this, left to right, Anne, Emily, Charlotte, just like in the painting and with a similar triangular composition. Let's now consider the similarities between the women in the photograph and known images of the Brontë sisters. But before I do that, please give me just 25 seconds to plug this channel and to introduce you to the sponsor of this video. Very Nearly Interesting is a brand new channel and I need all the help I can get. If you like this video, please click like. That way YouTube will show it to more people. And please consider subscribing. That way we might see you again and you might watch more of our content. This video was made possible by playbark.com. They sell everything you need to create an outdoor play area at home for your children or grandchildren. They can even come to your home and install a bonded rubber play surface, just like you see at the playground. Please visit playbark.com. There's a link in the description. The Brontë Society maintain that the women in the photograph bear no resemblance to known paintings that we have, so we need to look into this more closely. Brontë researchers, Brontë fans, and myself beg to differ. I'm not going to make a comparison for the Emily Brontë figure. There's only one verified painting with verified provenance for Emily, from when she was 15 or 16. But there is a painting out there that bears a striking resemblance to the woman in our photograph. But it remains unverified with very murky provenance, so I don't think it would be helpful for this video. But she was described to appear somewhat masculine in appearance with prominent cheekbones, elements that we can see in our photograph. For Charlotte Brontë though, we have the pillar painting. That one has crystal clear provenance, and it's considered to be the painting that gives the most accurate likeness of her. There are other portraits of Charlotte, but many experts believe that they've been idealised and embellished. Elizabeth Gaskell, Charlotte's biographer, said that the pillar painting of Charlotte bore a striking resemblance to her. It was said that Charlotte had a slightly crooked mouth that turned down to her right, and her hair was very slightly parted to her left. Both of these features can be seen in the photograph when we look at the image as the photographer would have seen it through his viewfinder. Friends and family of Charlotte Brontë told of her piercing brilliant eyes, so piercing that it could be hard to maintain eye contact. Anne Brontë was thought by some to be asthmatic, who was known to constantly breathe out of her mouth, which resulted in her lips always being slightly apart. She will have had to pose for the daguerreotype for 5 minutes or more in the same position. She will have had to keep her mouth open the whole time, and we can see that in the photograph. This sketch of Anne Brontë was made by Charlotte in the mid-1840s, and it's said to be a good likeness of Anne, and in my opinion bears a striking resemblance to the Anne Brontë character in our photograph. All of my research sources for this video have been left in the description. They're a fascinating read, and I've only scratched the surface of the evidence that's out there that points to this photograph being the Brontë sisters. My humble opinion is that yes, it's the Brontes. We're indebted to the original researcher that made this incredible find. A link to their work is in the description. Furthermore, clever researchers have pored over the detail, and almost 2,000 amateur sleuths have corresponded in a Facebook group on this very subject. None of them seem to have come up with a credible reason why this can't be the Brontë sisters. On the contrary, they've come up with hundreds of reasons why it could be them. For me, the most obvious reason is it looks like them. We do have to be careful here because there are a lot of myths and falsehoods that surround the Brontë sisters. By the way, this was Emily Bronte's favourite phone box. This is the exact telephone box that Charlotte Brontë used to call her publishers in 1847. But the Charlotte Brontë comparison with the pillar portrait is stunning, and features that we know about Charlotte are all present in the photo. How friends and family of Emily Brontë describe her are all present in the photograph. The sketch made by Charlotte Brontë of Anne Brontë fits with the photograph like a hand in a glove. Anne has a very distinctive profile, and we can see that in the overlaid comparison. The debunkers have laid out the reasons why this photograph can't be the Brontë sisters, but researchers and amateur detectives have dismantled those reasons one by one. Dismantled so comprehensively that it only makes me more resolute that yes, this is the Brontes. All of the debunked points have been refuted one by one. Is it time for the Brontë Society to look again with fresh eyes? I think it's them, but we can't say for sure. Maybe a romantic and wishful side of me is taking over here. But I can't help thinking that we're just one step away from proving without doubt that yes, this is the Brontes. Can a link be found with the collodion positive that was found in France with John Stewart? We know he lived there, and we know he visited the parsonage 3 times on photographic missions during the writing of Charlotte Bronte's biography. Is that the missing link? Is that the smoking gun, the final piece of the puzzle that will encourage the official custodians of their name to make that final leap of faith? If our photograph can be linked more comfortably with John Stewart, it's game over and our story will be complete. The clever researchers and the online army of devoted enthusiasts will have achieved something incredible, unearthing a photograph bearing the true likeness of the world-famous Brontë sisters, almost 170 years after their death. What do you think? Are you convinced, or do you need more proof? Have the researchers made a wrong turn somewhere and sent us all on a wild goose chase? Or have they stumbled on the photographic find of the century? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please click the like button. That way more people will see it. And please consider subscribing. That way we might see you again. And please have a look at some of the other stuff on our channel. There's lots of interesting things on there. Well, very nearly interesting.